Okay, the Goblin Brouhaha session 4 ended with my party deciding that they wanted to start a civil war amongst the goblins, which I was very excited about because I had, set up just what they needed in order to realize that that was an option without having to force them into it. And I felt super glad about that. So, session started off with them just outside of Scrimbley's Hollow. And because it was a goblin town, I wanted them to have some fun, non combat goblin encounters. And I don't know, there were a couple funny ones. Sort of like a comedic relief set of moments to lead up to what I was expecting to be like a little more spooky. The first thing is they had a goblin just on the side of the road challenge one of them to a game of dice, just high roll, and they bet a star. They were like, place your bet, and they pointed up at the sky at one of the stars, and a player picked one as well. And then when the player lost the dice roll, he looked up and he couldn't see that star anymore, and the goblin had disappeared. But then I narrated that like your party members can still see the star, and they saw the goblin run away down the alleyway or whatever. So that was fun. Scrimbley's Hollow itself is like, I described it as, the air is very humid. There's kind of this mist around to give it kind of like a weird, mysterious feel. I employed some AI art this time to kind of show them, like, here's what the entrance of the warren looks like. It was this very nice piece of AI art where it was like this big open cavern, and it sort of showed like what some of the buildings looked like, where they were kind of like almost like termite mounds, but they kind of had like they kind of like went up and had a corkscrew shape at the top. So I implemented that, and that's like, I don't know, that's maybe like a cool idea that I can use in the future. Is just using art to give inspiration, even if it's like AI art. I have been like utilizing Night Cafe a lot, just to not as like a stand-in for having ideas or like thinking about how things are going to look, because I am thinking of pretty much everything visually, but to sort of like kickstart or supplement ideas that I have. And then if it's a cool enough picture, I'll like put it in the group chat and say like, this is what you're seeing when you come to Scrimbley's Hollow. They had another encounter. This one was like a little more lengthy, but I thought it was fun, where there was a goblin. They had to do a goblin investigation. There was a goblin who was murdered, and they got to see like how goblins would deal with this. They'd be like, wait, would they even like care about this if somebody got murdered? It's like, yeah, they probably would, at least a little bit. You can't just have a society where people could just get away with killing each other, even though they kind of can, but ostensibly they can't. There was a dead body, and I set it up so that there was 4 goblins. Let's see if I can remember their names. Neek was the barkeep. There was Juki, Pud, and Mink. And Juki was very obviously guilty. He looked like crazed. He was like shaking. His hands were covered in blood. It was very obviously him, and it was him, okay? It wasn't like a red herring, but what I wanted to mess with was that maybe they would think he's a red herring, but he's actually not, and it's just very straightforward. Pud had a bag full of stuff that he did not want the party to see, and Mink was just kind of like chilling, sort of looking shifty in the background. So what they found out was that Pud is a moss collector, and the bag just had moss in it. Okay, nothing like too crazy there, but they did have this moment where they're like, what's in the bag? Is it gonna hurt us? Like, I'm afraid to open this thing, man. And then they questioned Mink, and they found out Mink could not have committed the murder because he was home killing his wife, which is pretty dark, but also pretty hilarious. That like, and their reaction was just like, whoa, okay, we're gonna put a pin in that. I have this one player, Garrett, who he's so great because he does like verbally respond to things. Like, he does wear his emotions on his sleeves when it comes to stuff like this. So when he thinks something is cool or funny or weird or whatever, he'll say it out loud, which is great feedback for me, being the DM. because, you know, it lets me know like, oh, okay, I want to do that more, that kind of thing, because it gets a reaction out of him at least. And occasionally, like, that prompts the other players to react too, which is great. But it was very obviously jukey, and when they started questioning him, he didn't really have that much to say, except like he was angry and he was doing violence, and then he started like foaming at the mouth. And they go to the barkeep and we're like, we think it's Juki, and they turn around and Juki's like already out the window. He's like run away. Basically to show that, you know, just to reinforce the idea that goblins are very lawless and they don't care about things the same way that they do, which is important. It actually came up later when they decided to put their plan into action. The last encounter that they had before actually going to the Warrens, Warrens meaning like the underground kind of cavernous set of tunnels where the goblins are bred. And before they went in there, they encountered two goblin magic users who were having an argument. And when they approached, they sort of deduced that the argument they were having was about what kind of gift they should get Mama Scrimbly. And my players were great. They did a nice little perception check to listen in on them. They butt into the conversation and they're like, here's what we think that you should get for her. And then they were like, why does she need a gift? Is it her birthday? And then they were able to explain, no, she's just upset because she wanted one of her children to be Brouhaha, which was great. That turned on the lights for them. Now, it did mean that they didn't really want to fight Mama Scrimbly when they encountered her, but they I'll talk about that later. So they kind of went into it with this plan of like, oh, we're going to sort of encounter her socially, like it's not necessarily going to be a fight, which isn't really what I intended. I didn't intend for them to think that we need to bring her a gift, but the part about trying to explain to her why she kind of have grievances with the Brouhaha was important, because it opened up like a whole nother avenue that they could pursue to do this quest. So the Goblin Warrens were like, I did spend a bunch of time kind of like mapping out how they were going to get into different places, and that did kind of pay off, and it kind of didn't. Well, it paid off. It worked. Like, the map that they followed was like helpful, but I think the way that I had routed it out, there was like maybe too straightforward of a path. I did want them to kind of like see more of the side rooms and like some of the other stuff that was going on in the Warrens, but they got to see some stuff. They got to see the kitchen. They got to see this weird room where they harvest slime from this big slug that almost makes like human-like noises, where it's just like, oh, which was pretty funny and somewhat disturbing. I really wanted the Warrens to feel claustrophobic. This is one occasion where, both for Scrimbly's Hollow itself and for the Warrens, I had some pre-written descriptions of like things I wanted to say. I wanted to talk about how, because of the like high humidity of the Warrens, the walls were like, had a bunch of condensation on it. It was like sweaty inside of the tunnels, and it got really like tight at times. There were a couple occasions where, you know, to get through these really tight tunnels, because they're not made for people, they're made for goblins. To get through these really tight tunnels, they had to do a dexterity check. And at one point, the fighter was able to get ahead of everybody else, and he on his own tried to get into so he was going through a DC 12. I kind of had split it up in two ways. I had DC 12 tunnels, which were like, you know, you got to do your dex save and you got to get through it, but most people will be able to. It shouldn't be too bad. But then I had a DC 16 tunnel that he tried to get through, and he got stuck. So then my players had to go take an alternate route to go along with him and pull him out of the tunnel, which I don't know if it felt quite as like tense or claustrophobic as I would have liked it to. Even though I was kind of describing how he was like just kind of stuck in there like head first, his like shoulders were, you know, locked into a position, and how his beard, because he's a dwarf, was like kind of like just smushed up against his face, and he was just getting really hot and sweaty, and it was starting to get hard to breathe. Maybe I could have upped the stakes and within that time maybe start making some constitution checks or something like that. I don't know, but it didn't quite feel as tense as I wanted it to, but it still mechanically was kind of interesting, I think. They ran into some goblins and they were like, take us to your leader, we're here to perform for her. And they were able to convince those goblins to escort them to Mama Scrimbley. That didn't help them. In fact, it meant that there were 4 more goblins that were going to be positioned behind them this time when the fight started. So I'd say it's in question whether I did the right thing here by making Mama Scrimbley basically immediately become hostile, and like initiative was rolled like immediately. Like they came in and she was basically just like, get them, because I kind of decided like behind the screen, I was like, well, people kind of know that these adventurer parties are coming into the ache that they're kind of invading, and it would be reasonable for her as like a high-ranking lieutenant to know that people were liable to show up, right? So I think it's reasonable for me to say, as soon as she saw them, like, roll initiative. If they really wanted to commit to this plan of like, we're here to entertain you and give you a gift and stuff, I guess they could have done that. They are allowed to do improvised actions and skills in combat. So I guess if they really wanted to commit to that, they could have like kept trying to do it even after we rolled up initiative. But once initiative was rolled, one of my players did mention like, oh man, we kind of wanted to do this like passively or whatever. We got through like the whole Warrens without combat. So he seemed like a little bit disappointed that it did go straight to combat. But here's the thing. I thought the boss fight was going to be really cool, and I wanted to do it. And I was like, hey, it doesn't have to end with her dying. It can just be like, you defeat her and then she's willing to talk to you, which I think that's a reasonable way to go. If they want to talk it out with the villain, it doesn't always have to be pre-combat, it could be post-combat. And I think going forward with their plan that they have, they'll have more chances to talk things out without even having a combat. So in this case, I'm like, I don't really mind. I kind of just wanted to do this boss fight, so we did it. It was very much focused around the minions. I was using Goblin minions and the minion rules from the MCDM book, the Flea Mortals book that I have pre-ordered and have downloaded PDFs for. Minions is like a super simple concept. You have like kind of like a regular monster, but you treat it as if it has 1 hit point. There are some other like helpful things about it, like they do static damage, so combat is like way faster. They just kind of like do their thing and they do X amount of damage with just the attack roll, not the damage roll. So they ran pretty well. And the other key thing about them is they make your party feel cooler, because if they do an attack roll or do save based damage, then you act like they have 1 hit point and that any amount of damage will be enough to kill them, but they also have like an actual HP threshold. For example, the goblins have 6 HP, but you treat them as if they have 1 HP. However, if an attack exceeds 6 damage, so they still roll damage, and if it exceeds 6, their HP total, then the damage carries over onto another target that's within range. So that was really cool, because I think my players got like really stoked when the fighter, like with his greatsword, cleaved off the heads of 2 goblins at a time in 1 attack, and they were just like, wow, that's really cool. So I think it worked really well. I think I was worried, just like having so many bodies on the field, that the action economy was going to get screwed and then the goblins would just overwhelm them. So I played it pretty safe. I had like 8 goblins in the room to start. Oh, plus the 4 that they brought in with them. So about 12 goblins in the room, and I was like, that's kind of a lot. I was a little bit worried, especially because they were down a player. But once they got into combat, these guys were dropping like pretty much every player turn, and sometimes they would be taking out more than one. So it's just like, okay, this is really interesting. They're weaker than I thought they were going to be. I thought they were actually going to be like a real threat, but it turned out that they were more easily dispatched than I thought they would be. I could have probably had like twice the goblin minions and things would have worked out okay. Especially because I wasn't playing them like in the most brutal way I could have, because of Mama Scrimbly's abilities. Now, Mama Scrimbly's stat block was one that I was very excited about. I did want to run her very well because I thought her abilities had a lot of character. So she's a caster, and I described her as like, you know, super old, decrepit. She's like hunched over. She's got like a little wispy beard, and she's wielding a staff that has a goblin skull on it, and above that skull is like a little flame just suspended over the skull. Super cool, and I demonstrated right away because when they came into the room, those two casters who were trying to deliver her a gift had brought her a knife, and she immediately just like sucks the life out of one of it, and he just kind of like collapses and has his life kind of pool up into a dark red orb over like where the flame used to be. So right off the bat, I kind of explained this, not explained, but I demonstrated this is how her abilities work. They're based on sacrificing goblins. And then I had her do it to one of the goblins who came in and started explaining like, hey, these guys are here to perform for you. She just does it to him, and he just like cracks and like crumples back, like he's a, I don't know, like he's a crushed soda can or something. And that communicated right away, like, okay, this lady is brutal and does not really care for her own children that much. So it was a very flavorful fight. It had a lot of good ideas. It wasn't executed super well. It's a fight that really could have done for some playtesting, and I haven't necessarily tried to do that with any of my fights before, but I think more than any of them, that one could have benefited from it. Not because it was like super imbalanced, just because the way it played out was like not terribly satisfying. It wasn't quite, I wanted it to be, you know, dangerous, but at the same time, I didn't want the damage to be the main threat. I wanted it to be the fact that they had to navigate this situation. Mama Scrimbly didn't have a lot of offensive capabilities. Once she had gathered a soul, it was kind of like charging, and she could shoot it out as just like a no attack roll, straight 6 damage, which is pretty good. But it takes, you know, 2 turns to do that, to like sack the goblin and then shoot out the energy. A couple of other abilities were like sacrifice a goblin to turn it into a fear device. So I described it as, you know, a goblin in front of you just like sheds its skin as if it was like wearing a towel, and you just drop the towel, and its like flesh falls off and the bones sort of rearrange itself into this grim effigy. And that was really cool, and anybody who got close enough to it would have to make a wisdom save where they would be frightened, which is a cool status that I would like to play around with more. The other thing she could do is she could like, you know, obviously just like kill a goblin to heal herself. So she had like some cool abilities, and the offense was not her like main thing because she had all these minions that were going to be doing the damage for her. If I had playtested ahead of time, there's some things that I could have tweaked and improved a little bit. I could have like played around more with the number of minions, and I could have seen like beforehand, oh, these guys, like, despite being a ton of them, if they only do 1 damage as like a static like attack damage, that's really not that much. My players will be fine if there are like tons of them. They ended up killing like 16 goblins by the time they were done with the encounter, so it was pretty wild. The other thing I would have tweaked was I wanted one of her big like showcase villain moments to be that she turns all of the goblins into walking bombs, and I had to make adjustments to that on the fly during combat because I realized that the way I wrote it was not going to work out. Because the way I had it was like every goblin minion in the room would become like a bomb and start bloating up, and then on their next turn, they would just kind of automatically explode. But I realized like my players are just going to get out of the way. They're just going to run straight towards Mama Scrimbly. I had written that the goblins can't take an action and that instead they just do that. They just explode. And I realized like that doesn't make a ton of sense to me. In the moment, I was like, well, I sort of like did a technicality on myself and I was like, well, it says they can't do an action. It doesn't say they can't move. So I did have them like able to do their move on their turn. And their action could have just been replaced with like exploding for a bunch of damage, which was a good way to get some offense in there and make the minions more dangerous. And it was cool. It did like a ridiculous amount of damage. I want to say 8, 9, so like 26 damage total to the ranger, who, you know, because she was a Goliath, she was able to reduce some of that damage, but it was like a big thing. She had like 3 goblins all run at her and explode, which was really cool. But I hadn't intended when I wrote it that the goblins would be able to move, and then I realized like this would be stupid if they can't. I also kind of made an adjustment in my mind where I was like, okay, the explosion is not just like triggered because she used this ability. She turns them into a bomb, and then when she wants it to go off, she kind of like sets them off. So I kind of interpreted that as like the goblin can use its action to explode rather than just having it automatically happen on their next turn. Because I realized if all the goblins just explode on their next turn, then the battlefield is just empty and the fight is over. That would be an extremely stupid thing for Mama Scrimbly to do. So I adjusted on the fly to say like, okay, they don't automatically explode on their turn, but they do have the ability to use their action to explode. So that was a big adjustment. If I had playtested it ahead of time, that would have been something that I had messed with more. I did have this other feature where the room was just filled up with like a ton of little tunnels, and if you go into one, you could come out the other. That ended up only coming into play like once, and it didn't make that much of a difference. I wanted that to be more of a feature. I think the room should have just been bigger for one thing, and there's a bunch of stuff I could have adjusted. So even though like narratively and flavor wise it was like a really cool fight that worked really well, on the other hand, mechanically it was just like didn't line up super well. So I don't know, I got to think about like ways that I can playtest things, if I can find like some online tools or something that would help with that. I know they exist, I just haven't ever utilized them for something like this. So there you go, that was the fight. And it did have like some really cool satisfying moments. Like it was actually scary when those goblins came and like blew up, and they, like I said, it kind of like came out of their mouth as if it was like, you know, just a bunch of poison, but because it was too much pressure, instead of it just bursting out of their mouth, their head just kind of like explodes like this. The effigy, the little totem that she made, was like really cool, and Garrett again like was like, oh man, that's like pretty cool that he like asked it. So it's like the bones are like rearranged into like a not goblin shape anymore, and I'm like, yeah, it's like it's just kind of like standing there like a just like a totem or whatever. And he was like, oh, that's pretty cool. So I like getting those reactions. And one of the biggest reactions I got, because we know that Goblin is one of Mama Scrimbly's kids, the little goblin that they've been carrying around with them. I asked when the turn after she had like used her ability, I asked, so who has Goblin? And they were all like, wait. They just had like an immediate reaction because they knew what I was gonna do. And after we talked about it, I was like, yeah, I think Garrett has Goblin on like just slung over his back or whatever. And I was like, yeah, you feel Goblin start to swell up on your back. And that was a big moment, because they were like, oh my gosh, because he's Mama Scrimbly's kid, she could just like kill him at any time, like just any moment. And it added this like ticking clock element of like, we got to beat her like right now. So everybody just kind of like bum rushed her, and it's sort of again not mechanically super satisfying that they were able to do that safely, but narratively it was kind of cool. They like knew like, oh my gosh, we gotta save Boblin. So the stakes kind of changed. It wasn't about like, we are worried about dying in this combat. It was like, Boblin could just be used as a tool against us, and in the process we'll take a bunch of damage from his exploding corpse. So it was a satisfying moment. And then afterwards I had her surrender, which I think was a reasonable move. That's probably what she would have done. In fact, Nick actually like stole her staff away from her, and I was like, well, at that point, she's a frail old woman, so she'll just give up. Okay, she's not going to like try to fight to the death at this point when she's like grappled, has her weapon stolen, all that kind of stuff. So there you go. The most interesting thing was the post-fight discussion that they had with her, where they told her like, hey, we understand that you felt kind of like burned and you're kind of bitter about this whole Brouhaha thing. And she said, well, that's the way it is. I'm still basically committed to providing magical support to this battle. And they said, how about this instead? We know that you would like to have had one of your kids be the Brouhaha. And she's like, yeah, but that's like now how it works. And we talked about the lore a little bit and how goblins intuitively know I'm supposed to name my kid Brouhaha. Therefore, there's never been more than one at a time. There's never been two. So when they presented this to her, it's like, what if we took Goblin and we started telling people that he was Brouhaha? She just kind of like sits there like, it was like breaking her brain. And I was like, she doesn't know what would happen. You guys don't know what happened. Anything could happen, right? So it was really cool because I think my players felt really, really clever, because they were like, oh, we've like found this whole other way to resolve this issue. And then me, in my mind, I felt great because I was like, I knew that was an option from the beginning, like before we even started the game. I knew that it was an option to kind of split up the goblins. And then after, I kind of said this before, when they started joking, oh, what if Goblin turns out to be the Brouhaha and we just have him with us? I kind of took that and I was like, Mama Scribbly wants one of her kids to be Brouhaha. And there was a couple great moments. They got to know what kind of a character she was based on how she fought, which is one of the reasons why I wanted the fight to happen so badly, is because when she's like sacrificing her kids in order to power all of her magic, that says something about her and about goblins, right? And at one point, she said something about like they were trying to convince her to get in on this plan, and she was like, well, I love my kids, which was great because they all reacted to it and they all understood. At this point, like, they really understand how goblins work in this world, at least, and they realize that like they're very callous, they're chaotic, with a capital C, evil, and they don't take care of each other very well. There aren't really good Samaritans in Goblin society very often. They might look out for each other out of necessity, and they're kind of still on the same team. Like, they all understand, like, we're the goblins, right? But their social graces are just so poor that they almost seem like sociopathic. And I think by like the way they interacted with Mama Scrimbly, where they like laughed at this line where she said that she loved her kids after what had just happened, and the fact that they came up with this plan and they're like, we can get the goblins to fight each other, shows that they are like tuned into the setting and they understand how the goblins work, at least a little bit more than they did when they started, which is great. It means they're engaging really well, and that's a perfectly reasonable plan because goblins are so crappy to each other, and they had that demonstrated multiple times just in this session, but also in the previous sessions. they knew and they kind of like pieced together that this is something that could work. So now their plan is like to kind of build Boblin up. They're just going to start referring to him as Brouhaha now and go around to the different lieutenants and try to convince them to sort of be on their side of this conflict, which again was an idea I had from the beginning. It's like, okay, this I kind of listed off the ways just in anticipation, like how might they resolve this, and thought of a bunch of different ones. And one of them was absolutely like create a schism within the ache, and that's what they went for. And I'm glad that I know that they're going to go for that, because then I can plan the adventure accordingly and figure out how all these different lieutenants are going to react to that, whether they've seen the real Brouhaha, whether they haven't, whether they've just heard rumors or whatever. And based on how much they know and their own personal like feelings and how they would operate, will they accept it? How easy will they be to convince? Stuff like that. So that'll be really fun. I also know where they're gonna go next. I had Goblin just kind of say like, okay, where are we going? Like pull out the map and say like, what's the plan? Which is great, because I'm not necessarily telling them where they need to go. They just kind of have the map, and then they say we're going to the gore pile next, and I'm like, sweet, that's what I'm planning next. And I am excited for them to go to the gore pile, because I have my red caps planned out, and I think the red caps are really, really cool. And even though red caps aren't goblinoids in the whatever monster manual, I don't think they're in the monster manual, but whatever book that they are in, I don't think that they are goblinoids. But in this setting, they are goblin gnome hybrids, just kind of like how hobgoblins are goblin human hybrids. So they are pretty jacked up, and they live in a pretty jacked up place. So that's exciting. They don't even know who lives there. They just know that the other goblins don't want to go there, and they don't like associating with them. So it's exciting. It'll be a good session next time. Yeehaw.